Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. I had always prided myself on maintaining a clear boundary between my personal and professional life. Teaching at a prestigious university carried a weight of responsibility, not just for the student's education, but for the ethical example. I said, my days were filled with lectures, office hours, grading papers, and attending meetings that left little room for distractions. Desire, passion, or temptation, those were things that existed in novels or in other people's lives, not mine. Then she arrived. Her name was Elena. She was in my advanced literature seminar, a bright, curious student with an intensity in her eyes that set her apart from her classmates. She asked questions, not the rote, procedural questions most students asked, but probing, thoughtful, and at times challenging questions that made me pause mid-lecture. There was a spark of intellect in her, a fire that demanded engagement, and more than that, attention. At first, it was entirely academic. I encouraged her curiosity, offered guidance on research papers, and provided feedback on her essays. But there was something beneath the surface, a subtle magnetism, a way she looked at me during discussions, a light in her expression when we exchanged ideas that stirred a discomforting awareness in me. I reminded myself repeatedly that this was wrong. She was my student. She was under my professional responsibility. Desire had no place here. It began innocuously enough. Office hours became slightly longer than necessary because of her questions, and I noticed I was anticipating her visits. I found myself thinking about her when I was alone, her insights replaying in my mind, her laughter echoing in the quiet moments between lectures. One rainy afternoon, she stayed behind after class to ask about a literary theory I had mentioned. As we discussed the concept, standing side by side in the empty classroom, our hands brushed while reaching for the same book. A jolt ran through me, a mix of thrill and alarm. I stepped back immediately, muttering a polite correction, but my pulse refused to settle. Weeks passed, and the tension grew. She began emailing me questions about her essays, which I answered promptly and thoroughly, though I noticed the tone had shifted subtly. It was personal at times, thoughtful, reflective, flirtatious, in a way that could almost be dismissed as playful curiosity. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overreacting to her attentiveness. But the truth was that every email, every smile, every lingering glance began to feel like a small surrender of control. The turning point came one evening after a departmental lecture I had given. Elena approached me in the hallway to ask about additional sources for her thesis. The corridors were empty, the university unusually quiet. She leaned closer to examine the notes I was holding, and for the first time, I felt her hand brush mine. Deliberately, our eyes met, and there was a hesitation, a pause filled with unspoken understanding. I told myself to step back to regain composure, but I felt drawn to her, irresistibly. The moment stretched long enough that the professional barrier began to feel fragile. One night, I found myself grading her papers late in my office when she unexpectedly knocked on the door. She claimed she had forgotten to submit a draft and needed my feedback immediately. The office was quiet, dimly lit, the city outside casting faint shadows on the walls. She approached my desk, placing her notebook before me, and I noticed the soft curve of her shoulder, the slight tilt of her head, the way her hair fell over her face in a manner that made my thoughts impossible to discipline. As I offered suggestions. Our knees brushed under the desk. My heart hammered, my breath caught. I tried to focus on the annotations in her paper, to speak only of literary critique, but my mind betrayed me. She looked up, and in her eyes was an intensity that mirrored my own conflicted awareness. Something unspoken passed between us, a recognition of a shared pull that neither of us could deny. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and utterly forbidden. The first kiss came weeks later, during a private meeting arranged under the guise of thesis guidance. The tension between us had been building, restrained yet relentless. She spoke softly, leaning in to discuss a point in her argument, and the world seemed to narrow until it was just the two of us. Our lips met briefly at first, tentative, testing the waters, and then with increasing urgency. It was a collision of intellect and desire, a combination I had never experienced. Every rational thought I clashed violently with the raw emotion. I felt, from that night on, our encounters became a delicate, secret rhythm. Meetings, emails, and office hours took on dual meanings. A simple discussion about narrative technique could end with a lingering touch, a hidden glance, or a whispered acknowledgement of our attraction. Every interaction was charged, the thrill of forbidden connection blending with guilt and excitement. We met in cafes under the pretense of discussing her research, in quiet corners of the library where our hands could brush and our knees could touch beneath the tables. We wrote emails to each other that were professional in content, but loaded with undertones that only we could read. The secrecy intensified. Our bond, each stolen moment more intoxicating than the last dot despite our care. The emotional weight grew heavier. I felt guilt gnawing at me constantly, the moral and professional implications of our affair pressing down like a physical weight. Yet the pull was irresistible. The intensity of our connection, the intellectual and emotional intimacy, became addictive. I began to lose hours of sleep, thinking about her, worrying about discovery, and wondering how long we could maintain this fragile balance. Eventually, a careless message, sent in haste, threatened to unravel everything. I realized that our desire, thrilling and consuming as it was, carried real consequences: academic, professional, and personal. The fear of scandal, the threat to my career, and the knowledge that I had betrayed my own principles became unbearable. We made the painful decision to end the physical and emotional intimacy, to retreat into strictly professional boundaries. The transition was difficult. Every lecture, every office hour, every campus interaction was tinged with memory and longing. Yet, we both knew it was necessary. She finished her degree with distinction, and I returned to my role as her professor with renewed commitment to integrity, albeit haunted by the knowledge of the fire we had ignited and carefully extinguished. Years later, I still think of her not with longing strong enough to disrupt my life, but with a profound awareness of the power of desire, temptation, and human vulnerability. She had taught me more than literature ever could: the potency of attraction, the danger of blurred boundaries, and the necessity of restraint. The memory of our affair, intense and secretive as it had been, remains as a lesson etched deeply into my understanding of human emotion, ethics, and the delicate balance between desire and responsibility. I never imagined that teaching literature could become a lesson in temptation, one that would haunt me long after the final semester ended. It started with Elena, that brilliant and insatiably curious student who seemed to radiate intellect and subtle charm in equal measure. Our initial conversations had been strictly professional, focused on interpreting text, analyzing characters, and debating literary techniques. I prided myself on maintaining a calm, detached demeanor, but every discussion with her carried an undercurrent. I could not quite ignore. It was in the quiet hours of office visits that the tension began to crystallize. She would linger after. Other students had left, asking questions that were not on the syllabus, pointing out nuances and passages I had not considered, and debating interpretations with a fervor that left me both impressed and unsettled. One afternoon, while we bent over a particularly dense passage in the corner of my office, our shoulders brushed and I felt an almost physical jolt, a recognition of a force between us that was intellectually exciting but dangerously personal. I looked away quickly, focusing on the page before me, but the awareness of her presence lingered far longer than it should have. As weeks passed, I noticed a subtle shift in her behavior. Her emails became slightly more personal, containing observations about my lectures, suggestions for further reading, and the occasional playful remark that hinted at a familiarity beyond that of a professor and student. At first, I rationalized it. She was enthusiastic, inquisitive, and deeply engaged in her education. But I couldn't deny the effect it had on me. Each message stirred a mix of admiration, curiosity, and an emotion I tried to dismiss as mere professional satisfaction. Our encounters outside the classroom, library meetings, study sessions, and cafes, or brief chats in empty hallways took on a tension that was nearly palpable. There was an unspoken understanding in the way she looked at me, the tilt of her head, the way her fingers hovered near mine when she handed me papers. I began noticing details I had not before, the way her hair caught the sunlight streaming through the windows, the way she laughed softly when I praised her analysis, the quiet confidence in her posture that seemed to draw me in against my better judgment. One evening, during a review session before finals, she stayed behind to discuss her thesis, and the classroom felt like a world unto itself, empty, warm, and intimate. She leaned over the table to point out a line in her draft, her hand brushing mine, and for a moment, the academic pretense slipped away. I caught her gaze, and there was a tension in it, a challenge and a question that wordlessly demanded a response. My heart raced, and I realized that the boundary I had vowed never to cross had already begun to blur. From that night on, our interactions became a careful dance of intellect and unspoken desire. I found myself looking forward to her visits, lingering over explanations, and sometimes finding excuses to be near her, to witness her brilliance up close. She, in turn, seemed aware of the electricity between us, sometimes teasing, sometimes coy, but never openly crossing the line, yet the tension was there, undeniable. Emails became a medium for subtle games, each carefully crafted to remain within professional boundaries while hinting at something more. I found your perspective fascinating. I'll need to hear more, she would write, or your critique helped me see this differently. Thank you. The subtext was electric, and each time I read her words, I felt an inner conflict I could barely contain. One weekend, while the campus was quiet and most students had gone home, she asked if we could meet in my office to finalize her thesis draft. The room was dim, shadows stretching across the walls, the only light coming from the desk lamp. As she leaned over the papers, her hand brushing against mine repeatedly, I felt an ache I had never known, a longing that went beyond mentorship or admiration. I struggled to keep my thoughts anchored, to respond only to the intellectual discussion before us. Yet my senses were entirely attuned to her presence. It was impossible to deny the magnetism between us any longer. One afternoon as we walked along a quiet campus pathway discussing her upcoming conference presentation, she looked at me with a vulnerability I had never seen in a student. Her hand brushed my arm briefly, and the world seemed to constrict to that single charged contact. I felt the pull, irresistible and terrifying, and in that moment, the dichotomy of professor and student, of right and wrong, became painfully real. The first kiss came not out of calculated desire, but out of a culmination of months of proximity, shared intellect, and suppressed longing. It was electric, abrupt, and overwhelming. It left me breathless and reeling, a combination of guilt and exhilaration I'd never experienced. From that night, our relationship was transformed. Clandestine meetings, stolen moments, and subtle touches became the rhythm of our connection. Every discussion, every study session carried an undertone that neither of us could openly acknowledge, yet the thrill was inseparable from fear. I constantly reminded myself of the consequences: scandal, loss of professional credibility, and the ethical breach that shadowed every interaction. But the emotional intensity, the intimacy born of shared thoughts and suppressed desire, made it increasingly difficult to retreat. Each touch, glance, and whispered word deepened the bond while amplifying the guilt that accompanied it. We developed an intricate code of communication, a way to exist together in shared intellectual and emotional space without attracting attention. A casual brush of a hand, a lingering look across the lecture hall, a hidden smile, all became expressions of an intimacy that was both exhilarating and perilous. I lived in a constant state of alert, aware that any misstep could unravel everything. Even after the semester ended, the emotional imprint lingered. We communicated sparingly, maintaining distance publicly while privately grappling with the residue of our intense connection. She graduated and I continued teaching, but the lessons she had imparted of desire, intellect, and human vulnerability remained with me. I realized that what we had shared went beyond physicality. It was a collision of minds, hearts, and unspoken longing and education in the profound. Sometimes dangerous complexity of desire. Years later, I think of Elena with a mixture of awe and caution. She had taught me that desire could exist in subtle, intellectual, and emotional forms, that temptation often arises where we least expect it, and that restraint is as crucial as passion in shaping character. The experience reshaped my understanding of human connections, the responsibilities inherent in trust, and the power of ethical choice. It was a lesson I could never have learned from a book or a lecture, a lesson she, without even trying, had taught me with every glance, word, and moment we shared. The weeks that followed our first forbidden kiss were a tempest of emotion, each day a careful balance between desire and restraint. I found myself replaying that moment in my mind countless times, analyzing every brush of her hand, every glance that lingered a second too long. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me like a stone. She was my student. The trust of the institution and my career hung in the balance, and yet my thoughts betrayed me at every turn. We continued meeting under the guise of academic necessity. Office hours became extended consultations. Library corners turned into private debates over text, and long walks across campus were framed as discussions about research. But every interaction carried an undercurrent that neither of us could ignore. Her laughter, once simply a mark of intelligence and enthusiasm, now seemed to carry a subtle invitation, a hidden acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between us. I found myself listening to her words with a heightened awareness, noting the cadence of her voice, the way she leaned closer when making a point, the warmth in her eyes that spoke of something more than intellectual curiosity. Every evening, when I returned home, I wrestled with guilt and exhilaration in equal measure. I would sit in silence, reflecting on the risks we were taking, reminding myself that the thrill of our connection was a dangerous fire that could consume everything if allowed to burn unchecked. At the same time, I could not deny the intoxicating pull of her presence, the way her mind engaged mine, the way she challenged me in ways no one ever had. It was a paradox. I feared the consequences, but craved the connection that defied all reason. One afternoon, while reviewing her thesis draft in my office, she reached across the desk to point out a detail in our argument. Our fingers touched, lingering just a moment longer than necessary, and a jolt ran through me. I knew that moment, small as it seemed, was a turning point. I could feel the tension in the air, the electricity that hummed quietly but insistently. I wanted to pull away, to retreat into professionalism, yet every fiber of my being urged me to linger, to acknowledge the bond that had been quietly growing between us. The campus became a stage for silent communication. Hallway encounters, chance meetings near the library, and shared smiles during lectures became charged with meaning. We spoke in coded language, referencing literary works, characters, and ideas in ways that hinted at emotions neither of us dared voice openly. Each nod, each subtle brush of the hand became an intimate language only we understood. The danger heightened the intensity. Every interaction was heightened by the knowledge that we were treading forbidden ground. Late nights became a ritual. I would stay after the building had emptied, grading papers, reviewing lectures, and waiting for the brief moment when she might slip back for an additional question or clarification. Those nights were quiet, the world reduced to the soft glow of desk lamps and the muted hum of fluorescent lights. When she appeared, leaning slightly over a textbook, discussing interpretations, and occasionally laughing at my pointed critiques, I felt a combination of exhilaration and dread. My mind was fully alert to the ethical boundaries we were crossing, yet my heart was drawn irresistibly toward her. Despite the intensity, we were careful. Public appearances were always perfectly professional. Her emails were polite and studious, carefully worded to avoid suspicion. We navigated a web of closeness and discretion, each aware that one misstep could unravel years of career and reputation. Yet in private, the closeness deepened. Our discussions became personal without ever crossing into overtly romantic territory during the day. Our connection simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the small, stolen moments when the world was quiet and we could exist in our own charged universe. Sometimes, the weight of the secret threatened to overwhelm me. I would catch myself staring longer than appropriate, replaying her words in my mind, imagining scenarios that would never be acted upon, yet felt vivid in the solitude of my office. I wrote notes drafts, reflections, careful analyses trying to make sense of the tumultuous mixture of admiration, longing, and guilt that had taken root in me. Each evening became a quiet battlefield of ethics and desire, reason and instinct, propriety and temptation. One particular night, we stayed behind. After a seminar had ended, discussing a particularly challenging passage from a 19th century novel. The room was silent except for the soft scratch of pen on paper and the faint rustle of turning pages. She leaned closer, pointing out a textual nuance, her shoulder brushing mine lightly. My pulse raced, every sense heightened by the tension. Between us, I could see the same mixture of curiosity, admiration, and subtle longing reflected in her eyes. Words were unnecessary. The silence between us was charged, a delicate acknowledgement of the intensity that had grown over months. Eventually, graduation approached and the world outside our secluded academic bubble began to intrude. The inevitability of endings cast a new light on our interactions. Each consultation, each discussion, each shared laughter carried an added weight, the bittersweet knowledge that soon the proximity would vanish, that the boundary we had skirted would return in its full, inescapable force. Our final conversations were a mix of professional critique and personal reflection, subtle gestures of farewell hidden beneath the veneer of academic courtesy. Even after she left campus, the emotional imprint lingered. Emails became less frequent, replaced by carefully worded updates on her career, her studies, her ambitions. I read each message with the same heightened awareness, savoring the connection while acknowledging the distance that kept it safe. The intensity of those months remained, transformed into a quieter, reflective appreciation of human emotion, intellect, and the power of restraint. Over time, I realized that the true lesson Elena had imparted was not about desire in its physical form, but about the complexity of emotional connection, the subtle pull of intellect and empathy, and the careful navigation required when temptation exists in forms that are not easily named. She had taught me to recognize the depths of human feeling, to confront my own vulnerabilities, and to understand the consequences of actions left unchecked. Years later, I look back on those months with a mixture of awe, caution, and gratitude. The experience shaped the way I viewed relationships, the importance of boundaries, and the delicate balance between intimacy and propriety. Elena, without intending it, had shown me that desire is multifaceted, that temptation is often intellectual and emotional as well as physical, and that self-awareness and ethical decision-making are paramount when navigating connections that carry both exhilaration and risk. Even now, when I think of her, it is with clarity and respect. The memory of our time together is vivid, yet tempered by the lessons learned, a reminder that human connections are powerful, nuanced, and sometimes dangerous. I carry the knowledge of those months with me, a constant testament to the power of restraint, the complexity of desire, and the enduring influence of someone who taught me more than any text or lecture ever could.